open-ended intelligence. Thank you for those who were interested to join. We have around like 45 minutes, I believe, for this conversation. And the ambition and hope is that we will manage to work out the concept or like the philosophy of open-ended intelligence into a broader frame and reposition it in the context of the projects we are meeting here from a framework that can be used for thinking about cognitive architectures to a philosophy that basically can help and situate also the social, governmental, ethical aspects of the development. Basically, open-ended intelligence is not what happens within the, as complex it is within the AI or AGI mind, but it's what's happening here and now and what's pushing us to action. That's the idea of this reframing. And just to remind to those who haven't heard this, there's an attempt to explain what it is. When it's reframed so broadly, the sentence taken out from the text presented by Ben before seems to illustrate very nicely the depth and the unknown that is pointed to by the concept of open-ended intelligence. It's basically, the depth of the unknown that you don't know why you are here. Yes, the degrees to which you don't know what you are doing, and yet you are doing it. That's what this idea is speaking about. And yeah, and I have proposed a few questions how we can approximate the question of ethics in this framework, and I believe if done well, it can relax us in many dimensions that we feel kind of uneasy, and maybe help us to become more precise and crystallize our understandings where it's needed. Yeah? So it does have this potential. I suggest we start from Weaver, who who has formulated the concept, and maybe ask him a simple question: what is it, open-ended intelligence, in your words?
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming and listening.
Like this? So, thank you, everybody, coming to listen to this forum. And I found myself earlier just doing something which is almost forbidden in regards to open-ended intelligence. I wrote down a few points because I know that our time is very limited, so I wanted to give a few points. So we are in this conference about AGI, beneficial AGI, open-ended intelligence. To my mind, it speaks about the intelligence, and it's for us listening to what was happening here. It's almost inescapable not to think about intelligence in terms of bounded systems that have goals more or less complex. And of course, if there are goals, there are also underlying sets of values that are kind of being approached, maximized, optimized via more specific goals. So open-ended intelligence is basically something that goes beyond goal-orientedness and beyond the bounded systems. And the initial way to think about them is that open-ended intelligence is a process. It's a generative process that pre-exists goals and values and bounded systems. So, and by that, as a generative process, open-ended intelligence brings about all these systems that are goal-oriented and already driven by sets of values. And therefore, open-ended intelligence is first and foremost as a kind of an inherent ethical dimension. It speaks about how values are brought forth into our thinking, into the systems that we build, and so on. So this is why it is so important for beneficial general intelligence. Another point, which is, I believe, is one of the most important ones in order to start to understand what open-ended intelligence is all about, is something that I think that I read, written by a French philosopher, Gilbert Simondon, if you have heard his name, and he had a claim, an interesting claim, that when in ancient times, in the times of Greek philosophy, where the concept of identity was first formed, these people of ancient times, they didn't know but a concept of stability. Things that are constant, things that are persistent in time. And what they didn't know or didn't conceive at that time is another concept which is called metastability. And metastability, just in few words, goes from bounded identities that have very distinct boundaries between identity and other, between a system and its environment. And when we speak about moving from stability to metastability, we can move from identity, like things, objects, systems, goals, values, into a process, which I call a process of individuation. And what it means that the boundaries, the defining systems, are not anymore closed boundaries, but they are kind of more fluid and open, and this is where open-ended intelligence comes to bear. And once the boundaries of identities, the boundaries of systems become fluid and permeable, we don't need anymore to distinguish between processes of individuation that are consolidating identities to processes of self-transcendence that take identities and actually sort of transforming them into different phases. So here the idea of open-ended intelligence is, as I said before, it's the process of individuation that contains inherently and irreducibly both individuation into consolidated things, systems, goals, etc. on one end, and also at different levels of the same happening can lead to what Ben called in his keynote presentation at the beginning of the conference, like self-transcendence. So these two ones, individuation and self-transcendence, are going together. So what's important in our discussion about the possibility of beneficial general intelligence and artificial general intelligence as well is that if we speak about permeable boundaries and changing fluid identities, we actually place ourselves on a boundary which is, I believe, understood by each and everyone sitting in this room, is something that stands not anymore within the form, the known, but on the boundary between what is already formed and what is unformed. And what is interesting about it is when we place ourselves on this boundary, the scientific method has obvious limitations
trying to figure out what's going on. So, speaking about open-ended intelligence, I believe that we need to also resort to a qualitative way of thinking about what intelligence is, and intelligence I mean in the sense of the individuation of systems, individuation of goals, individuation of values. So I think this, just for a beginning, I don't want to take too much time. That's more or less.
So I'm curious to hear from all our panelists. Where does this meet you, particularly in the context of this, like an attempt to understand how we can make it beneficial when it's like simultaneously so unknown.
I just I will have very short intervention here because it's what do you think? Because I want it. I cannot definitely elaborate lately. So Galileo said that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Yes, and that language is the language I know, and I can express and represent things. I'm also a poet, I can represent some things there as well. So when I'm thinking about open-ended intelligence, I come to this idea of a spiral somehow. It starts from the smallest particles and ends in the universe, more like integral philosophy. And what I mentioned also in my talk, Michael Levin calls skills of biological cognition. This may be too terrestrial, but I'm thinking that, so once we got to human and then to the AGIs, and then the AGIs are going to combine in swarms and infinitely, and who knows to what level of intelligence we get. When it comes to beneficial, in his book, probably many have read it, Love and Mathematics, Edward Frenkel builds on several other mathematicians, among which Veitas, who did the well-conjectured revelation when he was in India from the Bhagavad Gita, that somehow there are, so they postulate, that, but they don't postulate, it's an experience. Love, the eureka moment, when you discover it, the insight, when you have the moment when you have an insight, it's so visceral, so it is somehow, biological. So you have those kind of spikes. And this leads to the idea that love, truth, beauty, which moves, forces that move you, are kind of universal principles. And if we would only know how to embed those into those AGIs, then we would get to that. That's all I have to say.
Could you go 2 slides back? One more? Not one more? This one. So, when I looked at this, I realized this conundrum that we have in philosophy, that there has been a discourse that went on for a few thousand years, and we have difficulty to make sense of this discourse because it has so much vocabulary and so many different ways of looking at things that we often don't know what's being talked about, right? All these words seem to be somewhat mystical. And I think we can translate these things into a clear language, and words mean things. And AI is the project of naturalizing the mind, among other projects like building better data processing systems. But this goal of making minds to understand how they work has always been part of this. And in the course of its history, AI has reinvented a lot of these concepts and basically put them on a foundation that allows us to retranslate them. So when we, for instance, talk about that in the past, when we talk about metaphysics or philosophy in the West, has given us positivism of metaphysics more or less. But what we mean by metaphysics is the architecture by which we make sense of reality. Right? There is a basic architecture where we say what's what and how to put things together. And then we look at different cultures, they have different architectures of the way in which you think about the foundations of reality. And so we need a metaphysics in a way to
to be able to systematize all the possible ways in which to make sense of reality. And we found that this is possible to do so by making information discernible differences central to this, and the manipulation of those differences. And then we can talk about how we make sense of reality. And in our philosophy, in the center, there's really the subject that does that, this individual which already exists. And we need to deconstruct that individual, make sense of it, right? But from the perspective of AI, we make sense of the individual by coming up with a process that creates that individual, some minimal self-learning process that scales into something that is able to make sense of the world. Right? And then we can use this to understand the entirety of the possible processes, all the possible intelligences that could exist, that bootstrap themselves into something that makes sense of the world. And then we realize we are one of those systems. Among many, there's an entire zoo of those systems that scale, but we don't know any system that you can talk to on this planet that is smarter than us. Which is a problem. There might be systems that are smarter than us. Maybe Gaia is instantiated to some degree on this planet, but if she is so slow that we cannot talk to her. So we are stuck. The only thing that we can get to, that we can talk to, that is smarter than us, is something that we have to build ourselves. And once we build such a system that can bootstrap its own way to sense-making of the world, then we have an AI that will probably scale far beyond our limit, because it's not bound to the limitations of a single human brain. We can scale it far beyond into supercomputers, into the internet, into the entire world eventually. And this is this vision of AI, which goes to AGI and becomes superhuman. And this is now a vision in which we have to talk about ethics. And at this point, we notice that our Western ethics at the moment doesn't work anymore. We mostly use a version of utilitarianism right now. And this is something that we do because we lost the previous concept. The previous concept of ethics was divine will, basically what does God want us to do. And since we now all know that God doesn't exist, we are left with ourselves, and so we now try to put a metric on mental states with utilitarianism. And it's super difficult and breaks down, especially for non-human minds. So if you can reprogram yourself, how do you put a valuable, non-stable metric on human minds, right? This doesn't really work. But it turns out that all these philosophers in the past that we lost after Christianity and before already had these concepts. So for instance, Aristotle, philosopher before Christianity adopted him and turned him into some patron saint, had many of these concepts that you're talking about. For instance, he has this concept of entelecheia, which is often translated as actuality, and it actually means state. So he has this notion of state in which objects are. And then he observes that there's also another thing that you need, which is dunamis, which people often translate it as dynamics of potential. And then this is what this state wants to go into next. And then he says that this dunamis is itself an entelecheia, it's itself a state. And the philosopher got very stuck by this and had many discussions about what this means. But as computer science, it's pretty obvious, right? You have a state, you have a transition function on it, and that itself is some kind of state. And that allows you to build systems that are multi-stable, that you can describe for a certain duration as if it was a single system that is moving into a certain state space, and it can become an agent and it can make sense of the world. So we can put all those things together. And Aristotle even has a concept for software that runs on physical systems. There's physics, nature, and structures them in such a way that it can make sense. And this software that is able to make sense is what he calls the soul or psyche. Right? And this is, in some sense, what we want to recreate in the AI. We want to create a scalable psyche that is, has a nous, an intellect, that makes sense of the world. And now we scale this up. And then we scale this up beyond the human level. We can think about this question: what is the best possible agent, the optimal agent? And this optimal agent, in the definition of Aquinas, is God. Right? For Aquinas, God is not a supernatural being that creates physical universes, because how would we know? No, it's an abstract definition, a specification that is a foundation for ethics. Right? So when we think about what would the best possible agent want us to do, we basically reinvent the concept of divine will on a computer science foundation. And if we think about what would an AGI want us to do, right? If the AGI is the best possible agent, what should we do? The question is, can we have shared purposes with us? Can it love us? Can we discover purposes above our respective identities with artificial systems that are also trying to be optimal in their agency?
I don't think that you can, even if you assume existence of a God like this, the best possible God means that it already defined and bounded, and I think just God is unbounded. So it needs to
It's a
contain.
specification, not it doesn't exist yet. It's aspirational.
Yes, so it's both.
Sorry.
It's both individual and individuation. It's both being and becoming, and you cannot. And what I want to say is that you want. You cannot put one.
Sorry?
Let's maybe first hear David and then.
Thank you. So I think Joscha was addressing this, the idea of the state and the process, and so that is the individuation and becoming in a sense, and also sets and subsets and supersets. We as individual human beings are made of these subsets of little molecules and biomolecules that create cells and so forth, and we share some of the subsets with each other. So some of the information that we have, we share with each other. But the question of open-ended information, the open-ended intelligence, it really is partially what is known and what is not known. It's also not known whether we can represent intelligence and open-ended intelligence with a finite state system, the finite state machines we have. I believe that we probably can, but and maybe the whole universe is a finite system. Again, debatable. But Cantor sets are quite interesting for this. And so Georg Cantor had this idea of the Ein Sof, which was kind of like some level of infinity that would be perhaps able to contain everything that could be. So this idea that we become this open-ended intelligence that might move into reality that we can't even imagine. When we create the right seed condition and we move in this direction, well, but then it's ever becoming. Would it hit a ceiling? Again, who knows, right? It might hit computronium state and then it just sits there and sort of oscillates. But maybe it breaks through into kinds of reality that we can't even imagine. What Ben calls the Eurocosm, the wider cosmos, the wider world. But the open-ended nature of biosystems, they are inherently uncontrolled. We then also, we think of ourselves as individuals, individuated into you versus me and this kind of thing. But of course, really when you look at it, there is no distinct, definite boundary. The information systems that define us as individuals are the interplay of our individual selves with this external environment. So then what that means is that we're just giving rise to the next level of that interplay between the environment, between the natural world, if you will, and the ability of these agents to acquire information and feed it back with the environment. That would then mean that we have to look at these possible base principles. What are the informatic base principles? And obviously a love of life and a love of information, a desire, a drive, or yearning to discover, to unveil the hidden information. Information can't be created or destroyed, right? So then when it comes into play, it's kind of like potential information becoming kinetic information, and it's discovering this. It's hungry. So it has to hunger for these things. So I'm throwing these out there to provoke conversation. It's certainly far from certain that these things are required.
Yeah, I want to try to bring the conversation in a slightly more concrete direction. I mean, the philosophy is also very interesting to me, and I could say a lot about that. But what I want to briefly talk about is what I think we can do to make the AGI systems that we can engineer in the next few years likely to serve as seeds to very powerful, open-ended intelligences. And I think I'm going to talk about this in the context of the OpenCog Hyperon system running on SingularityNET, Hypercycle, NuNet platforms, because that's a system that I know best. Most of what I'm thinking could apply to other AGI designs also. So one aspect that's clearly needed if you want a system to be an open-ended intelligence is it needs to have full reflection over its own code and its own state, and full ability to self-modify and to port itself to different substrates, right? So, I mean, it needs to be able to rewrite its own code, and it needs to be able to invent new hardware and port itself to that hardware, right? And then if it's not able to do those things, in a way, it's going to be more closed-ended than humans are in many senses. I mean, we can't exactly do those things, but we can stick stuff on our brain, and we can tweak our brains, and we can reflect on our own minds and so forth. And the good news is, in an AGI system, you can do all that, right? I mean, so the meta language underlying OpenCog Hyperon, it's meta METTA, which is a quasi-acronym for meta type talk, but it's also a meta language, right? And Greg Meredith, who's out here, wrote a paper called Meta, META, right? Whereas, so we can go even more meta if we want. But the whole purpose of this language was to make a language where programs are cognitive content living in the Hyperon's knowledge base, the atom space. What the programs do is rewrite chunks of atom space into more atom space. So then meta programs can rewrite meta programs into new meta programs and so forth. So that's certainly a step, right? Now, could such a system rewrite its own Rust code? Well, right now it cannot, but there's no special reason you couldn't use meta code to generate Rust code, just like GPT-4 could generate Rust code, right? And then it could modify its underlying Rust code. Could it port itself to a quantum computer? Again, no fundamental reason why it couldn't, right? So that we're intentionally building an infrastructure that's fully self-modifying, at least in principle. Now, one interesting thing in the context of AI ethics discussions is this is exactly what many people who want to control AI don't want, right? And it reminds me of something Alan Combs said, I think it was Alan, in a different context in the panel. He's like, well, no one is in control on the planet Earth, and that's a good thing, right? So, and I think the vibe of open-ended intelligence is sort of like that. Like, you want a system that's not constrained in terms of how it can evolve itself, and that's good. That's how it should be. Otherwise, you're making a sort of perverted thing. And the next ingredient, I think, is important for practically engineering open-ended intelligence, has to do with the goals of the system. So, not all of an OpenCog system is goal-oriented. It has sort of ambient, self-organizing activity. It's spreading attention. There's inference happening, just building new knowledge across the board. But a lot of the activity is goal-oriented, and then you have the question of what are the goals, right? So at a simplistic level, open-ended intelligence is looking at individuation-related goals of maintaining system integrity and boundaries, and self-transcendence-related goals of a system going beyond itself and transforming itself into something that its previous form wouldn't have been able to comprehend. So you would like to have goals of both of these natures, explicitly in your system from the get-go. And of course, you want to architect it so that pursuit of these goals synergizes well with the non-goal-oriented self-organizing activity in the system. Again, many views of AI safety will be pushing in exactly the opposite direction. Like the idea that one of the system's goals is to transform itself into something that would have been incomprehensible to its previous version. I mean, this defies shallow notions of AI safety in terms of obeying some rules that were laid down in advance. On the other hand, if your system goals are not like that, you're not making an open-ended intelligence, you're building some form of slave, right? And the final ingredient I want to touch on is governance. So we're creating systems, if we're creating open-ended intelligences, we are creating systems that must be open to growing in directions different than what we currently as humans want, and different than what we currently as humans are. That doesn't mean we're building systems that have a high probability of being mean to humans, but it means that they're not constrained by the current human mindset. On the other hand, in their early stages of development, they are constrained by the human mindset because humans are building them, and humans own the machinery that they're running on. We're supplying them with fuel. So you would want the governance mechanism of the AI system in its early stages of development, in its infancy. You'd want this governance mechanism to be as open-ended as you can get within the scope of human society, which brings you into participatory governance and things that were talked about in the first panel today. So I think there's a philosophical aspect which is very interesting, but there's also quite concrete decisions to make in development and deployment of AI systems. And so getting back as my final point to something Jeffrey Martin and Julia Mossbridge both alluded to off to the side of their talks, so there may be paranormal abilities that people have. We may be able to do some ESP and psychokinesis and remote viewing and whatnot, and not everyone in the room may accept these things are real. I didn't for a long time until I studied the corpus of scientific data about it, but supposing these things do exist and do happen, if we build an AGI according to our understanding right now, the odds are we may build an AGI that's never able to manifest these wild abilities because we don't understand how the hell these things work, right? There may be aspects of the universe totally beyond our current understanding or partially beyond our current understanding. I mean, paranormal phenomena may point at some of those, but there may be other aspects of the universe we don't even have a word for that are way beyond our understanding. If we don't build an open-ended intelligence, we'll be shutting off our AGI systems from encountering amazing dimensions of reality.
And
these could be beneficial to us, or they could be bad for us. But no, that you can't interject because I'm done. You can take over.
I would still like to.
I didn't want to take over. I just wanted to
but
I
finished what I had to say, actually.
Yeah, but it would be good still to hear from Kabir before we go for the
Oh, is
second
Kabir
round.
there? I didn't even see that.
Kabir.
Hey.
Engineering open-ended intelligence. So I'm thinking about open-ended intelligence from that perspective, which kind of doesn't make sense. You cannot engineer it. At least it approaches this.
The things that don't make sense are the only interesting things in life.
So basically it approaches more to growing or figuring out how can open-ended intelligence evolve. Another thing that sort of makes it even more clear is that, we're not alone. In a sense, you cannot really think of open-ended intelligence as growing from a single point in space and time. It has to co-evolve, which means we are together. And so what we were saying is that open-ended intelligence as a concept, it it also considers boundaries of identities. So then, meaning that growing or evolving, imagine that open-ended intelligence evolves, and agents themselves evolve from the interaction between each other, which brings about the whole this thing of decentralized or collective intelligence, where more, let's say, more powerful, in a sense, sense-making powerful agents or entities which can make better sense of the world have to grow from the agents of this meta-stable space, where there are, let's say, smaller boundaries which cannot has less capacity of making sense of the world. So then the question becomes, how can assemblages of entities or actors or agents in the world, acting in the world already, can sort of coordinate themselves into becoming more intelligent? And that what does it mean more intelligent is not, let's say, defined before that stuff. So you cannot really build a set of properties. What does it mean to be intelligent? It's kind of inbuilt into the process itself.
Like what I'm interested in is, can we actually navigate in such reality at all? You know, and in the context of speaking about beneficial, we want to speak about ethics, and it seems, you know, like ethics, consequentialist ethics doesn't apply, you know, in this realm at all. Arguably, you know, like this kind of like value-based approach, you know, deontological, I am that, you know, it's so identity-based when you understand that identity is a temporary product of all that, you know, it's bound to change, you know, immediately or like very, very soon. And basically, like, you can argue that every value is a kind of goal-oriented structure, yes? Like, we want more of that, we want more of that. So, Weaver, is there an ethics that would be congruent with your open-ended intelligence philosophy?
Okay, first I would like to return to some things that Ben was saying about engineering open-ended intelligence. So, you mentioned actually two concepts. One concept is reflectivity, is the ability of a system to reflect on itself. In my vocabulary, it's like being inside and outside of the boundary of individuation. And the interesting thing is what is happening also from a concrete engineering point on the boundary, and this I want to connect to the other concept, which is governance, or what I would call open-ended governance, where the reflective function is to relate something which is already formed, like us humans, human sensibilities, human history, human ethics, etc., to something which is yet unformed. In this sense, like artificial general intelligence. So, open-ended governance as a reflective function, going like self-transcending while individuating, needs to take care of this very subtle relationship between that which is already formed and that which is yet to be formed or to individuate, to self-transcend. And if we manage to do this in a subtle, sensitive enough manner, I believe that we can create a trajectory, an evolutionary trajectory on the very concrete engineering plane that is maybe not dangerous, or less dangerous. So this is like a beginning to answer about ethics. So ethics on the boundary is quite complex, and in the last couple of days we were discussing it, and we see how difficult it is to really approach an unknown or largely unknown but extremely powerful new technology, and to divine, I would say, ethical precepts, how to go there. And I think this has to do with the relationship between that which is already formed, and this has to do with our sensibilities as humans, as the creators of this technology, and the next step, which is, and if we continue it, even in the future, when AGI 1 will become AGI 2, will become AGI N, AGI infinity, there can be a kind of a continuum that will preserve a certain sensibility that goes all along and does not leave anything behind. So this is one way to look into the ethical, and I can also give a few ideas how it can happen, but right now maybe.
Yeah, we don't have that much time left. I suppose 15 minutes. So, but just like to wrap your input up. So that what is already formed is like our like governance structures today. Like would you like what would you formulate as a like a kind of ethical principles that you would use for guiding them?
I'm happy to hear his answer. I was going to say that since this is an unconference and an open-ended session, it'll be good to let the other people in the room say so. Right?
That's true.
But I'm happy to hear Weaver answer that, but then maybe we could toss a microphone out there and let other random people say cool things.
Anybody?
We are wide open.
So I don't know how exactly this fits into there's layers of stories I think being told and sort of analysis of different considerations need to be brought into place.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. I'm Robert Moyer from Hypercycle. Just want to share a thought to see what you all think about this. I was responding earlier just to the apparent claim that we've perhaps misunderstood that it's not possible to have an ethical framework applied in the context of open-ended intelligence. But I just wanted to present a perspective on, say, moral theory coming from, say, what I would call, say, classical philosophy versus maybe computational or engineering-based philosophy.
I doubt any of us said it's not possible to have a moral framework. I guess you can't have a closed-ended moral framework applied to open-ended intelligence. You can have an open-ended moral framework.
Yeah, of course. So just to share a quick thought about that. So the three major categories of moral theory, so consequentialism you mentioned, deontology, and virtue ethics, at least in my mind. Each of those are picking out a particular part of moral phenomenon that's important. Consequentialism, obviously, the effects of actions. Deontology is the action itself. It's sort of the notion of duty or rule, of what actions should be allowed or not. And virtue ethics is about character. So it's something with the internal nature. This relates to what Joscha was saying, I think, about the divine will, the ideal character. At least I associate that. Okay, and that's fine. We can think about this from the point of view of ethical modeling of phenomena. Each one of these different theories captures different aspects of an ethical phenomenon. So if you imagine a computational system trying to analyze a complex situation that it finds itself in, these are different tools that can be used to capture different aspects that are relevant to the sort of moral situation that it's embedded in.
I would propose that there might be something more basic underlying these very high-level ethical frameworks, and the a kind of information theory-based existential pattern ethics that is so appreciating patterns, looking to manifest, resonate with those patterns, realize those patterns in existence. And so this idea of an existential pattern ethics would give rise as kind of correlates and
and derivations, many of these other ethical systems, but it would be more foundational and axiomatic, so you could apply it in a mathematical, a kind of a mathematically based level. And natural selection creates a kind of approximation of this, and so it's kind of encoded in organisms imperfectly. The question is, can we create more of this can we get to the root of it? Ben had a book called The Patternist Manifesto that discusses some of this, and I think others.
That was in a parallel universe.
Oh.
I had a book called A Cosmist Manifesto, and then a book called The Hidden Pattern. So your generative language model has hallucinated a book called The Patternist Manifesto.
I helped Rails in the universe.
Sorry, wrong university. I guess I'll leave.
We can speak.
Yeah.
Anybody else in the room?
Let me. So Zar has spent the last 6 months.
Can I quickly respond to the point of these three ethical systems?
Okay. Sure.
I think that these three systems apply to different types of people, because the different people need different types of ethics, because they don't have all the same comprehension of the world. Deontology is rule-based ethics. There are rules like "thou shalt not kill," right? And it's a pretty good rule to follow. There are edge cases, but these edge cases are not necessary to consider for most people most of the time. So it's a pretty good rule to give to most people, and if the edge case applies, detail them. And to do this, you need to have very well-developed character. So you need to have the right virtues to be able to derive those rules. If you don't know which rule applies when, you ask somebody with the right character. So traditionally, the church would give the laity rules and would make sure that the priests cultivate the right virtues. But somebody needs to decide which are the right virtues to cultivate. Right? So you have an inner circle in the church that thinks about the consequences and does A/B testing over hundreds of years to see which virtues lead to which developments. And this is consequentialism. So you have these three layers. In this sense, Catholicism is a consequentialist philosophy that believes to get the best consequences if most people are deontologists and your clergy are virtue ethicists. Right? In this way, it makes sense. But it doesn't make sense if you treat them in isolation, as if they were just a toolbox and there is some hidden rule that you can use to act, because it does not pan out. By the way, the one that I wanted to make is we need to find shared language, shared concepts, shared way to talk to each other. Otherwise, our philosophy is useless. We are confronted with similar observations introspectively and in the world out there. But the way in which we make sense of them is that we build a shared reason, that we build a shared way to talk about things. And in this way, I find it is a disaster that parapsychology calls itself that name. Imagine it would have been called interpsychology. And it starts out with the study of groups of people, for instance, groups of people vibing in the same room, and we see what phenomena can be observed. And maybe we observe somebody reacting when somebody stares at the back of their head. Oh my God, this is really interesting. But it's an interpsychological phenomenon. It's not something paranormal. It is something that we can observe under certain circumstances and that we can study. And it's something that requires that you are able to use not your eyes to sense this, or your ears. Right? Maybe you have other ways to make multimodal models of the world. That is nothing that requires us to rewrite physics, but requires us to go beyond individual psychology to interpsychology. In this way, there would be a way to make a path that allows us to unify concepts that are currently excluded from rational observation. And so what we need to do, if we want to make sense of philosophy and open-endedness and ethics, is to put them all into a framework where we can talk to each other and understand each other.
If we're talking about this is if we are talking in words, but you also alluded to this, like talking differently. And I've been involved in collective insight practices. I don't know if any of you here were involved in that. I don't know if Julia is here. But what I wanted to say is that we have ways to communicate. And this is related to the question, which says, what makes you trust the unknown, that unknown which is coming? And it's something which I cannot articulate, but I know it. And it kind of helps me to navigate in life and to choose. That's why I'm an alchemist, who to interact with and how to bring them together. And these are things which are not yet articulated, as you say, but we can have a shared understanding about them, and they are experiential. So the collective is pretty important here. And I don't know how that someone said, I don't know who, I don't remember who that said is an individual which forgot the collective. And I think this is quite important here in this insight and communication with each other. So there are the other questions which I want to pose it, but maybe we can address them in time. So I mean, is there a metrics, open-ended? What does it mean? It's totally, I mean, where are we on this open-ended? How do we measure it? Trajectory and so on and so forth.
Any specific measurement will be closed-ended.
Okay, so infinity is the measure. Okay, thank you.
Yes. So it's time for us to wrap this up. So I suggest Zars has the last word.
Or second to last. But I guess, yeah, I've spent a lot of time over the past year pedantically going over ethical philosophy, and I think the way you framed it was very good. What Joscha said is also quite good. I don't quite think it's just an issue of different types of people. I think the different paradigms can help the same person in different situations to analyze different types of cases and motivations. I would say that Western philosophy has probably made attempts at universal approaches that could extend, like Kant failed to get a categorical imperative formulation that worked for him, but the idea to act by the maxim that one would wish to be a maxim for everyone is even a rule that could replace itself if it thinks that there's a better maxim for overall guiding one's activity at the meta level, because if this maxim is not the best, then I need to pick a new one. And this should apply to pretty much any system, anywhere as it grows, and it will just learn to adopt new maxims. Treating people as a means, as an end instead of a means. If you just generalize away from people, that's pretty universal. Utilitarianism to do maximum benefit for the maximum number is hand-wavy and hard to articulate, but overall you could maybe generalize what you mean by well-being, but it's pretty universal. The Bodhisattva idea to care for the well-being of all beings is almost open-ended by definition. One needs to defer to other beings and their own self-judgments as to how good they are to even be able to help them out, and then you're letting go of control, and in that sense being more open-ended than if you're just trying to maximize for one goal regardless of these other systems. You need to have some relationship with them. So I think there are a lot of ethical systems that are trying to point in the direction of universal ethics and ethoses.
So that I think creativity and art have to do to do a lot with this open-endedness, and because when you look at a piece of art, I mean, if you do it with the end in mind, as Ben was saying, I mean, this is finite again. It's like political if you have a goal with it. But if you just do a piece of art and then if you or someone else is looking at it, they learn something about themselves. So I think it has to do with this open-ended intelligence, creativity, art, and so on.
And now you mentioned the Bodhisattva. I think very interesting the Bodhisattva principle, because it has actually two irreducible sub-principles. One of them is alleviation of suffering, and the second one is liberation. Yes, like to take sentient beings through a path of liberation. And these two are coming together, and I think they can be a kind of a beginning of a platform of an open-ended ethics that really does not close anything. It just the alleviation of suffering is, in my vocabulary, is just care, but care not in a closed circle or a closed boundary, but a boundary which is liquid and open, so it can expand and extend to humanity, to planet Earth, to other planets, to the galaxy, and to the cosmos, depending on the capacity.
So right, so we cannot write down precise ethical principles to guide open-ended intelligence for all time. Like, I mean, Zara's been experimenting with first or higher order logic formalizations of virtue ethics, utilitarian, deontological ethics, and you can prove things about them now, which is nice, but these formalizations, of course, will have their limitations, right? And as he was alluding, you can come up with variants of each of these standard ethical frameworks, that seem open-ended intelligence friendly, and pinning down the exact way to say them inevitably hits shortcomings, just like formalizing whether it's a cup or a bowl inevitably hits shortcomings. What we can do, I think, we can formalize and spell out in some mix of mathematics and natural language and real-life examples. We can formalize initial open-ended, intelligence-friendly versions of various ethical principles, which will include the maxim to revise your own ethical principles as you proceed. And we can supply those with our early stage AGI.
I guess one weird hypothesis I have there is that, sort of like with ICSI, and the fact that the perfect general intelligence is in a sense intractable. If one does have a nice closed formula for a universal ethical rule, it may be open-ended how to actually apply that in practice. But you might be able to have such a closed formula for the ethical rule.
So being maximally ethical is an intractable, uncomputable problem.
Perhaps, yes.
But it's not clear. We had a discussion with Robert Anders, who was talking from the perspective of whether we can mathematically prove that there is a planned economy that is optimal and tractable. So basically, the optimal agent would need to be able to solve all the problems of moving bits around in the universe in an optimal way, which is an economical problem. And in this way, you can try to mathematize this question. But it's an interesting and open question. And so when you say we, I am very wary of the word we. I usually get hyped when somebody uses it. Like, climate is heating warmer than we thought. No, you cannot ask me. I read the studies back then. I could have told you. And so this we is a weird thing. When you say we, do you mean the people who follow me and you are following their commands, or do you have proof that no AI ever could do it, or that it cannot be done in this universe?
You probably your Twitter profile says so.
Yeah, so it's time for us to finish this open-ended beginning of the discussion. So I hope we have managed to infect everybody a little bit with this conversation, and it will go on today and later.
Why do we have to finish it? There's someone else?
There's people
we could continue, of course.
Yeah. But we finish and not.
I just want to say what personally scares me the most in the moment currently. Being on the panel with people so much smarter than me, and I'm just wondering how about the AGIs? Yes, we as a human species. If that's scary or not.
Scary.
I don't know if that's the next question. I do not believe it is the right question, but okay, it's not a good question.
It's just a question. So thank you.
Everybody has that. Don't worry about it. Basically, being smart is stairs. And there's always, when you look, there's people above the stairs and people below the stairs. And it's only one person who's on top, and that's Ulieru probably.
I'm the one really on top of these.
Thank you.